G'day, it's Geoff here, and today in this workshop video we're going to be discussing and looking at axles, and we're going to be fitting these heavy duty axles to the Series 3 Land Rover. And I'm going to be discussing the difference between a heavy duty axle as opposed to the standard axles that came out in the day. We'll also be looking at the key principles and properties that go into actually manufacturing an axle. So it's going to be a good video, so stay tuned. Okay, so we've got the heavy duty axles here. Now the first step that we're going to do is obviously take the drive flange off. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about axles and axle snapping to begin with. Now, if you don't own a Land Rover, you probably would have heard that Land Rovers do snap axles pretty easily, particularly in the series vehicles. Now, I've been driving these vehicles for about 10 years and I've actually never snapped an axle. One of the reasons why is the Series 2, which I'll do a walk around in another video, actually has a modified rear axle system, and it actually allows it to carry the Salisbury axle. Now I'm going to explain in greater detail the difference between the Salisbury and the Rover style axle, and we'll also go into fully floating and semi-floating axles. But first of all, what is the difference between a standard axle and a heavy duty axle? So what is the difference with a heavy duty axle? These axles have been kindly made up by the team at TDA, Tekal Discovery Automotive. And if you want a set like this, press pause on this video and type TDA into Google and get in touch with Stuart and Julian at TDA. So what is the actual difference between a heavy duty axle and a standard axle? Well, it's actually the steel, the tensile of the steel, and how the steel performs under stress or under load. So this is where the wheel hooks on, the drive flange here, and this is obviously the end that goes into the diff. Now, if we had something that was relatively low tensile, so something that was quite malleable, something weak, something that we could bend, then it would be a bit like toffee. When you make toffee on the stove, you put it under tension, so it'd be trying to turn the wheel, be getting the power from the diff, and this would actually twist. Now it doesn't matter how hard you make the steel, it is always going to twist and flex. And this is something that happened particularly with the original or the standard axles in the series vehicles. And I'll just show you what happens. So this is an old one that I've had lying around. As you can see, it's gone rusty. So over time, it's actually twisted and flexed due to jumping up a hill. If you're going up a hill and the car's bouncing, that's probably the worst thing you can do for snapping an axle, because obviously it's under load, the wheel becomes airborne, it spins up, and then it hits the ground, and all that strain, all that stress goes through the axle to the differential, or from the differential to the wheel, and it puts so much stress and strain on the axle itself, it snaps. So the difference with this is obviously it's much lighter. The actual makeup of the steel and the tensile strength of it is slightly different. I think it's an RH6 steel that they usually use on these, but I could be wrong, and I stand to be corrected. But basically over time it twists, it flexes, it twists, it flexes, and this causes small little fatigue fractures to actually occur inside the steel itself. Now, when a shaft snaps, it's usually where it's been machined or where it actually steps down, and by steps down I mean actually change in the thickness of the shaft itself. So I can't show you on this one because the end snapped off, but I'll show you on the heavy duty axle. This is all perfect, one piece of steel. But then when we get down to the spline that goes into the differential, that's where the problem usually occurs, and that's where they're notorious for snapping. And that's because it's all one piece of steel, and then this has been ground down a little bit to actually go into the axle. whereas this is slightly different on this one here. The actual diameter of the steel has been slightly larger, and they've actually built this up around here, so it's nice and strong. So it doesn't give as much of a chance of their actually point of weakness for it to actually snap. Whereas on the standard axle, it's quite the opposite. The overall diameter of the axle is smaller, and then it's the actual spline that actually sits out. So this actually creates a weak point just around here where the axle's actually snapped. And so you can actually see here, I'll try and get it a bit closer to the camera, but you can actually see that it's actually just almost torn. It's not a clean break like someone's cut it. And that's what's happened. It's slowly over time just been moving like so, and then rip. It's come right off. And it makes an almighty bang, I can tell you that. So there are a few differences when it comes to axles. So we've talked about the steel, but that's only one variable. There's a lot more at stake here. And that's actually due to the spline on the axle itself. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So these are a 10 spline axle. So that means we've got 10 little indentations going into the differential. Then on here, we've obviously got this going to the wheel, and that's 10 spline also. Or going into the drive flange, sorry. So we've got 10 spline there, but then if we look at our modified heavy duty axles, I think these are 24 spline there. So what's the difference? Like there's more spline, but is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense when you're looking purely at numbers, but when you look at it from a construction point of view, it makes a lot more sense. So I've talked a lot about surface area in previous videos, and that is really one of the fundamental principles of any mechanical or moving object, machinery, anything. It really does come down to surface area and how you distribute the force or the stress or the strain that's actually being exerted on a part. So if you think of it like this, we've got 24 spline or 20 spline. I haven't counted them on this end yet, but we've got 20 there. We've got 10 there. So that's got more, this has got less. So you could say, oh, well, these are chunkier, so they're going to have less chance of getting ripped off. Well, that's one argument you could make. But what it actually comes down to is out of the circumference or the diameter of the flange that actually goes over, you want to cover every single possible millimetre or micrometre or tenth or fraction of an inch of that actual drive flange. So you can get as much of the force or much of the torque and power as possible exerted on the circumference of that drive flange. Because the more meat, the more metal that you've got in contact, the better overall that force is actually going to be distributed on it. So we haven't got as much there. It hasn't got as big a surface area as the 20 spline. And that is the key thing. Having a finer splined axle has a greater overall surface area. If we were to get a tiny little tape measure and measure the actual contours of this axle here, and then the heavy duty axle, we would end up probably finding that we would have twice as much surface area in contact with the drive flange here as we would on the standard axle. And that is a really, really, really important point. So because we haven't got as much here, it makes it a lot more prone for actual snapping. And that's what occurs. That is one of the key components. So I believe, from my experience, and this is only my experience, that is due down to the tensile or the actual makeup of the steel in the axle, and it is due to the actual spline itself. So that is why you get axle snapping, particularly in these vehicles. The other reason why is compared to Datsun or Nissan or Toyota, the Land Rover actually follows a very different doctrine, or a very different path of evolution. See, the Nissan Patrol, or the Datsun Patrol, the G60, and I think the FJ40, and might have been the early FJs anyway, all the components that actually were used in them were actually all off trucks, so they were grossly over-engineered. Whereas the Land Rover actually used differentials, axles and components that were actually designed to be used on saloon cars. So they weren't even really designed to be used on heavy-duty off-road going terrain. However, you know, they've obviously proved that wrong. It works, but you do have to do a few modifications to actually iron out a few of the little faults that have just occurred along the way. And even if you got one of the FJ40s or the G60 Patrols, they've got their own set of problems too. It's just the way vehicles used to be. You know, you used to spend a lot more time in the shed. So that's really my take on why we have these problems with these axles. And really, as far as a weak point or an Achilles heel, it is a really, really bad issue to have in a car. Clutches going, yeah, like the Patrols, they suffer from that. That's not great either, but it's something that can be fixed, not easily. It's easier to pull an axle and shove one in, but it can really, really ruin your trip. So the reason why I'm putting these heavy duty axles in today is I just don't want to take that risk. I would love to be able to fit a McNamara locking diff in this here, which I'll cover in another video, which is a very, very basic locking diff, which is actually in the Series 2. And this uses a much finer axle, finer splined axle, like this one here, actually out of the Salisbury diff. And basically it has a different drive flange, and there's a compression spring here. You take a bolt out and it shoots a slightly longer axle into the diff centre. It's a fantastic bit of kit, but they're rare as hen's teeth to come across one that's actually complete. So what we're going to do is we'll put these heavy duty axles in instead. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull the axle actually out of the diff casing, or the diff assembly, and we're going to be fitting also these beautifully made heavy duty drive flanges. And these are the exact same setup as the maxi drives. And just another note on that, the actual material that's been used in these axles is exactly the same as those on the maxi drive too. So they should be tough as nails, and knock on wood, we won't actually ever snap an axle. Fingers crossed. So we're going to be using these, and they're much thicker, and obviously, as I've already alluded to, they've got a much finer spline, so they will be a really good addition to this vehicle. So we're going to pull this apart, as I said, and when I do that, I'll actually discuss the concept of fully floating over semi-floating axles and the pros and cons that go with that. Okay, I'll just get into taking the axle out. So I've taken all the bolts out of the drive flange, and then I've actually been able to loosen the drive flange off from the stub axle assembly. So now I should be able to pull the axle right out of the diff. Voila. So how can I do that? How can I actually pull the axle just straight out of the diff? It seems almost too easy. Well, this is what they call a fully floating axle. And basically you've got two types. You've got fully floating and semi-floating. Now I'm just going to give you my definition of it, but basically if you've got a semi-floating axle, basically the setup is usually the bearing is actually pressed on to the axle itself. So you've got the stub axle, you've got the outer bearing, the inner bearing, and it's all one component. And then that whole component then slides into the diff. So there's only actually the part that goes into the differential that is floating. Whereas in a fully floating axle, the stub axle, the inner and outer bearing is actually all separate components. And this means that the axle is floating at the wheel end and also at the differential end, and therefore it is a fully floating axle. Now, fully floating in my book is much better than semi-floating, and I've been mucking around with semi-floating axles for about 10 years or so in my other four-wheel drives. As I've mentioned in other videos, I started off tinkering and modifying GQ Patrols or Ford Mavericks, and they actually have a semi-floating axle system in the rear of the vehicle. I've also been tinkering around with my Land Rover Series 1, which is a 1951 80-inch, which I'm halfway through restoring back in Tassie. And they also have a semi-floating axle assembly in the rear too, and that was indicative of the Series 1 Land Rovers. Now, one of the key modifications that you could do with the Series 1 Land Rover, and you can still do it today if you want to, is actually fit it with a Series 2 or Series 3 rear axle assembly. And by doing that, you get a slightly stronger diff, I believe, and you get thicker axles, and you also get a fully floating setup, which is much easier to service in the field. Now, one of the reasons why a semi-floating axle is such a pain when you're out in the bush or out in the Sahara, the Ural Mountains, the Amazon, wherever you may be, is the fact that when that bearing goes in here, you've got to get it off. And the annoying thing is, particularly with this, the GQ Patrol and other semi-floating axle assemblies, is it is the axle seal that always goes first. The axle seal goes, the differential oil then gets in to the wheel bearing and actually flushes all the grease out, and because it can't get quite enough in there, the bearing overheats, it collapses, and then you have a bearing failure. So it's really annoying. So what you need to do is you need to actually take a jig with you. I've done it on my Series 1, and to actually get it off, we needed to use a 20-ton press to actually get it off. So it's something that you really need to replace before any major trip or major expedition, or at least even look at, because it is a real problem, and not just on Land Rovers, as I've mentioned. The great thing about fully floating is I can just pull this out, I can flick this dust cap off, there is a castellated nut in there, there is a split pin, I take that out, I can pull the axle out, pop the remains of the snap axle out of the diff, and then I can actually just pull this axle out, bung a new one in, and off we go, and forget all about it. So it's really good. So in my book, I think fully floating is definitely the way to go if you're doing remote expeditions. And semi-floating, just, you have to think about things a little bit more. One more thing I will say about semi-floating axles is obviously there's a lot more care put into the bearings, and what I mean by the bearings, they're usually over-engineered, and that means that they cost a heck of a lot of money. They're not cheap at all. I was quoted once for my GQ Patrol $750 for 2 bearings. I didn't pay the $750, I went and got some other bearings from a cheaper distributor, but they are very expensive. Even for the Series 1 Land Rovers, and it's not due to their age, they still do cost you a bit. So you really want to take good care of your rear axle assembly if you have semi-floating axles. Anyway, that's enough about that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put in the brand spanking new heavy duty axle, and I'll show you how to do that and how it all works. So first of all, we need our drive flange, and we've got obviously this which sits on the end to stop all the gunk and muck coming out. The setup on the axle itself is very similar to the standard one. We've got a circlip that just sits around the outer edge here. Why does it do that? Well, that obviously stops the axle from being able to slide out and slide too far in. So that's important. So we need a little bit of grease. Just to put on the flange, just to help it slide on a bit easier, because these are new. And the one thing I find is with new cogs, splines, whatever, you can machine them to the best of your ability, but they'll always be a very, very tight fit until they've worn in a little bit. So having a bit of grease, a bit of engine oil or machining oil, just helps them slide on that little bit better. Now I've already done this for the long axle, for the other side, and they were a very tight fit. I don't like having to do this, but the only way I could get them on was knock them on like that. Get a nice big socket. Right, and that's got it on there. Got plenty of meat out here, so we can put our circlip on, and then we'll just knock this in ever so slightly, and we've got a nice firm fit. Now, when we put the axle back on, obviously we need to put a gasket, and you can do this two different ways, or actually, sorry, three different ways. Now, what we can do is we can get some goop called Celastic, or it is just like silicon, automotive silicon. It's different to your silicon that you use on the roof or for your plumbing, and the reason being is it's designed to be resistant to oil. If you use stuff for your roof, if you use stuff for your plumbing, taps and such, then what you're going to find is over time it's going to break down, and it's going to break down very quickly. So it is important to use the right stuff. One other thing that we can use here is gasket paper. Now, not a lot of people know what this is. It's fantastic stuff to get. And all the gaskets in the Land Rover pretty much use gasket paper, or they use what they call automotive cork, which I'll cover in another video down the track. If you get gasket paper, you can cut out your own gasket. Any gasket on the vehicle, you can cut it out yourself. It's fantastic. It's good to get another thing called bearing blue, and what this is, it's basically like a paste, but it's got a really dark blue dye in it. And what you do is you take the stub axle off, or you get the sheet of paper itself, and you put bearing blue around here. You get the paper, and then you just push it on, take it off, and you've got a perfect stencil of where you need to cut to make your gasket. So it's a really handy one to know, and you can pick that up at most engineering or automotive stores, along with the gasket paper too. The other thing is, whoops, that came off. The other thing is too, is the actual paper gaskets, the ones that are designed for this vehicle, they're relatively cheap. I usually buy them in bulk from the UK, and I was looking the other night, and I think they were 10 pence. So, you know, nothing really. So it's good just to buy 20 of them and just have them sitting in a drawer, and then when you do stuff like this, pull it out, whack a new one on, chuck it back in. So that's probably the 3 different ways that you can actually make a gasket for your drive flange. So we're going to use a correct gasket today, because when I took this apart last time I didn't have any and I was naughty. I used Celastic. So we'll use a correct one today, the paper gasket. So what I'll have to do now is I'll have to clean this all up and get all the silicone or the Sisaflex off it, and then I can make a nice clean surface to put the gasket paper on. And I'll show you how to do that too in this video also, because that's something that's a dying art. A lot of people don't know how to put a paper gasket into a vehicle. So that'll be the next step. So I better go fetch a gasket and then we'll get this axle in. Okay, so we've cleaned up the area here. I've just gone around with a screwdriver and just scraped off, just a flat bladed screwdriver, sorry, and just scraped off any of the residue of the Sisaflex. Now, what we're going to do, as I said, is fit a paper gasket to this. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, one of the best things to get when you're actually working on an old vehicle like this is a good, decent manual. And this is one I picked up when I was on holiday back in Tasmania, and it's called Automotive Mechanics, the Metric Edition. Now this one's actually an old textbook for automotive apprenticeship, and it's fantastic. It actually goes through everything you need to know to work on a vehicle like this. And everything that's actually mentioned in here, even though this book is now 40 years old, are all principles that you can use on your modern day vehicle. And it goes into much more depth and detail than what you'd get on any forum or any modern day equivalent. And it actually covers gasket paper, how to make a gasket, how to do it out of a number of different materials. So a really good one to get. So this costs $15 Australian, so it's certainly not going to break the bank balance. So that's probably about £7. So really, really good investment. One of the reasons why I mention that is I'm no expert, and I want to make that very clear. I'm not an expert. These are things that I've learnt over many years, and what I know, but I don't know it all. But I came across a mechanic once and I was having a chat to him, and the subject of gaskets came up. And he had a paper gasket, and then he was getting Sisaflex, silicone, and putting it over the gasket, and then sitting it onto the part, and then putting the cap over the part and tightening it on. And I went, why are you doing that? That's not how you do it. You use grease or you use oil, and I'll explain why. And it's mentioned in every manual known to man, certainly the older manuals, because people don't use paper gaskets anymore. And he just didn't know. So that was really interesting, and it does show that there is a certain amount of knowledge being lost, and that's certainly one of the inspirations for myself doing these videos for you. So how a paper gasket actually works is you put grease, or the best way to do it is to let it soak for a while in oil, thin machining oil, so 20W, or engine oil will do too, like a 20W50, whatever, as long as it's a light gauge machining oil. And being paper, it actually soaks it up and it expands slightly. The problem with using oil is if I get this gasket and I put it on the dry flange, and I look at you, I look at this, I go to put the axle in, it slid down. It won't hold in place. So an alternative that you can use is actually grease. And the grease will slowly be absorbed by the paper too, and it virtually creates the same effect. So what happens is this forms a bit of a sponge as it's soaked up with grease or oil, and then when you push the dry flange on, it then actually sets and then forms a seal around it. And so that's how you do it. And they last surprisingly a long time. So it's a much better way of doing it using gasket paper. The other thing is too that I've noticed over the years, and you can see it with this bolt in particular, is you get all this silicone gunk that goes into the thread on the bolt. It gets stuck inside here and you have to dig it out with a little screwdriver. So either I'm just not very good with silicone or it's something that's pretty common, but either way it's a pain. So it's really, you're much better off using a gasket. So what we'll do is we get the grease, we put a little bit on the dry flange here. The great thing is this is bearing grease that I'm using, not molybdenum grease. So if I get a little bit inside here, it's just going to get flushed out by the gear oil. So we smear a bit of grease on, not a huge amount. I'm probably putting a bit too much on here. But that happens in every cooking segment, they always put too much in. So we've got that on there. Yeah, oh, look at that, getting right in there. Okay. So we've got that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit on the dry flange too. The reason why I'm doing it here and I'm doing it on the axle is I can then simply put this bang on there, bolt it in there, and there's plenty of grease to absorb it. We can then go around with a rag and we can just wipe the excess grease off. So I just find it a lot easier. So we get this here, just wipe it around like that. Stay. Wipe this round. There too, like that. And the great thing is, what I'm doing here and what I'm explaining to you is not just something that is obviously related to Land Rovers. This relates to virtually any motor, any vehicle, any machine out there. So share this with your mates, put it up on Instagram or whatever you like. These are just basic principles and fundamentals of mechanics, really. Okay, so I've got grease there, I've got grease there. Now what we do is we get our gasket, we inspect it, make sure there's no cracks, there's no cuts. We also look and make sure that there's no dust or muck on it. There's not, it looks fine. So then we place it over here and we very carefully work our way around. If you go in and you start ramming it on, what's going to happen? You're going to tear your gasket. So, and they are a tight fit. So I usually struggle a little bit with these, but anyway, I'm not sure. We've got that sitting nicely. Now, because obviously I'm doing a segment on YouTube, I need to rush it along a little bit. But the best thing for this, if your gasket is a really tight fit, chuck it into some oil and just leave it for 15 minutes. Go have a cup of tea, coffee, whatever. Come back, and that would have actually just got a fraction bigger, and it slips over that much easier. But anyway, you can do it with grease, as we've just shown. So we make sure all our holes are nicely lined up, which they are. And we get the axle. And we have to wiggle it a little bit. Yeah. Hopefully the bloody thing fits. Okay. Now the reason why I'm jacking up the vehicle is because when I've put the axle in, I haven't got it exactly where it was when I pulled the old one out. I've probably gone over one spline or one notch too much. So we just need to hold it there, then I'll pop the bolts in, torque them up, and that's pretty much it. And that's how to pull an axle out and put an axle back in a Land Rover Series 3. Hope you've enjoyed it.